Hey everybody, it's Eugene Liscio. Welcome to episode 5 of Forensics Talks. Today our guest is Dr. Geoffrey Desmoulin. But before I get to him, I'm just going to make a few announcements like I normally do. And the first one is going to be about the IABPA conference. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly share my screen here, and you should be able to see the website. There's a conference November 16th to 20th, and there's a call for abstracts, which is out. If you go to the conferences and 2020 annual conference, you'll see that there's a form there that you can download. And please think about submitting an abstract if you're in the blood stain pattern analysis world. Also, Forensic Science Week this week. So there's some different things going on. If you're interested, you can head over to the forensicscienceweek.org website and have a look at some of the activities that are going on, and you can inform yourself there. Finally, there is a course that I'm going to be putting on next week, September 19th and 20th. It's a shooting documentation course. And what I'll do is let me just bring that up here for you really quickly. If you go to the AI2-3D site, what you'll see here, actually I'll bring it up here, go under training, and what you'll see is there's a 2-day course that we're putting on. This is a course that we run before. We had our shooting reconstruction week last week, and if you're interested, head over and then have a look at that. Okay, let me get going here with the reason that we're here. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Geoffrey Desmoulin. He's a biomechanical engineer. He focuses on incident reconstruction and physical testing. You may know him from the hit television show Deadliest Warrior. Ran for about 3 seasons from 2009 to 2012. There were about 33 one-hour episodes, and it highlighted about 64 different warriors. But today, Dr. Desmoulin is a principal of GTD Scientific. They offer biomechanical consulting services to their clients, and they work like North America and abroad. Most recently, he's been doing sort of a little promotion or series or whatever you want to call it on the science of violence. And I am definitely going to ask him about that. So on that note, let me bring him in here. Hey, Geoff, welcome to the interview.
Hey, Eugene, thanks for having me. I really appreciate what you're doing here.
All right. Well, thanks. So I want to ask you some questions. I want to start at the beginning. I want to go back. So you have a background, which I want to say is physical. And the reason is you were a firefighter. You were a former infantry soldier, if that's correct. I also know that you are I think you're a black belt, or you were involved a lot with some of the videos I've seen, MMA or the mixed martial arts stuff. So this is all like very physical stuff with your body and movement. So I have to ask you, what is it about human motion and kinesiology and all these areas that caught your interest early on?
Oh, super interesting question. If we're going to dial back that far, I'd have to say that the interest in what I do now came from being a firefighter / EMT. Understanding how the body was injured, seeing firsthand the results of incidents, and then combining that knowledge of the body to engineering principles such as pump pressures and heat transfers that I was getting from being a firefighter. And that's really that combination I just found very exciting and actually very powerful. And so when circumstances had it that I couldn't continue as a firefighter any longer, and so but the passion for that combination continued. And so it started in kinesiology, which just seemed a natural progression because it was the one program that offered the most amount of biomechanics, but it was also very physically oriented, where I could keep learning about physical training and how the body operates both in health and injury.
Right. So you have, so my understanding is you have 2 degrees in kinesiology. You have one in, is it biomedical or biomechanical? Biomedical engineering. And then I think your PhD was in mechanical engineering. Is that
That's
correct?
good. Yeah. Thanks for reminding me.
Well, you're a professional academic almost. You spend a lot of time in the education system. So
Oh, don't remind me.
yeah, no kidding. Um, so I mean, you obviously have these different fields, these different areas of study, and then you're sort of bringing them all together in your work today. Let me talk about, because I have to ask you about Deadliest Warrior, right? We have to bring that up. There's no way we can't. So um, let me ask you just quickly, if you can, how you first got involved, and I don't know, just tell me about like the experience and maybe what the show did for you. And you were like the science guy on there, right? So that's the nice part about it. I knew you were technical and you were dealing with the science behind what was going on. So I don't know. I'll leave it open to you just to discuss.
Yeah, no, I mean it's the elephant in the room, right? And I haven't been asked that question for a while, so it's kind of nice to go back and share the memory with you, Eugene. But basically, I was in the middle of my third degree. I was at Wayne State University in Michigan, which is really the founding university of injury biomechanics, which is really the crux of what I do. Um, so when I was there, I was literally in the cadaver lab when I got a phone call from Mr. Tim Prokop, who was the showrunner of season 1 of Deadliest Warrior. And it took me a while to get to the phone, as you can imagine. And he asked me some typical questions like, what's your background? What are you interested in? What equipment do you use on a daily basis? And oh, by the way, can you send us a video of you analyzing a fight between a ninja and a Spartan? And I mean, I just got a warm fuzzies all over, and I'm like, this is something I have to get involved in. And so I had a buddy hold the camera for me while I detailed throwing stars and the Spartan spear and the Spartan shield, and what might come of it based on certain scientific principles. And as the story goes, Tim reviewed the video, and it was one of apparently 1,500 videos, and as soon as they saw it, they said, "This is our guy." So that's how it happened. And in fact, we're still working together today. He's doing some developing some online content for us right now, actually.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, I imagine being able to do and set up all the experiments and all that stuff. Did you learn a lot from all the different tests and things that you did with the show?
Oh, 100%. It's not very often that you get a team of 100 people with a budget of probably $1 million per week, where I can literally ask for certain tests to be performed. And if they were visual enough, then the producers would say, you know what, this is cool. Let's do it. What do you need to get this done? And we need to get a cherry picker, and I need a $3,000 gel torso that's mimics the human body, and we need this firearm and this type of ammunition, and we're going to get SWAT officers to perform this type of whatever it was. And it was like a kid in a candy store. But over those 3 years, it really gave me a lifetime of on-site testing that I don't think I would have gotten anywhere else, and we've been able to pull on that ever since.
I've got something here I'm going to show you, because so I was online and I was looking at a video and I saw
Uh-oh.
an image of you with something, and then I thought, is this a friend of yours? It's just, I
Yeah.
think it's the same model that I saw in the picture. So I was like, oh my God, I think, and you're right beside it and you're doing all the high speed stuff. So I said, oh, you know what? I'm going to show that to him. He'll probably bring back some memories.
Well, the funny thing is about that, Eugene, is on season 1, the budget wasn't actually that big. I mean, it takes a while for the snowball to build, and we were trying to get things done as efficiently as possible, if you will. And they said, Geoff, we need a high-speed camera operator. Are you willing to do this? And I said, sure, I'll help you out. And so that was part of my role on season one, which I kind of regret doing. It was awful because, of course, every shot required high speed. And then I'm under pressure to transfer all the files and make sure we don't lose anything. And I'm talking to the director of photography to make sure they know how to backlight gel, because, you know, they're used to side lighting or front lighting, you know, certain items. And so it became a whole nother job on top of giving lines, but it was fun, and I don't regret it for a second.
Yeah, I think that's great. So let's talk about when did you, from the show, when did GTD Scientific start, or when did you decide that you were going to start this company and start? I mean, were you already consulting during that time, or was it after that you?
Great question. Literally, when the first episode of season one aired, I started getting phone calls.
Wow.
And people just saw me as someone who could comment on this type of activity, and it never stopped. And so at the beginning, everyone that was calling knew me from the show, and now everyone that's calling me knows us from our previous work product, which is nice, finally.
Okay, yeah, nice. And I mean, you've worked on some really interesting cases, and I mean, I've looked at some of the research and stuff that you've done. Can I ask you? I'll ask you about something more recent, which I've seen, and the term "science of violence." And can you talk about what that means to you, or and you know, it's almost like, I don't know, is it like a training series that you're doing, or what can you tell us about science of violence?
Well, thanks for asking, Eugene. We've actually got one seminar for free on September 30th that we're offering, just to kind of get the hook in, get the juices flowing, allow people to get a flavor for what we're terming the science of violence. And then we have another webinar on October 28th, 29th. You can inquire, and I know that conflicts with yours, so I don't want to hit it too hard, Eugene. But we also offer private offerings of this topic, and we're actually going to be down in Arizona offering a 2-day clinic, 2 full days on the science of violence. And basically, what it is you know, the overarching theme of what we do is we just apply the scientific method to violent interactions. And we all know Force Science, they're the ones that coined that term. They're the ones that really started this movement, and with Dr. Bill Lewinsky. But Bill Lewinsky is a behavioral scientist and focuses on human factors, and that is always important in a police defense case or a case where violence has occurred. But we step outside of the brain of the individuals, and we look at observable behavior with respect to our human factors, concepts that we do dovetail with the rest of our report. But really what we do is we take that scientific concept, use the methodology, and apply the skill set of understanding the diagnosis and the injuries that were involved, and then use the tools of the engineer to really detail the location, the magnitude, and the direction of the load that caused those injuries. Because the injuries are really an independent source of information, not just the result of an incident. And all too often, the medical examiner and the detectives aren't speaking the same language. Or even worse, you have an engineer, a pure engineer, with a detective and a medical examiner, and now you've got 3 different languages being spoken, and they all really kind of come up with a description of the incident on their own. And really, it's when you can team those up that the magic occurs. And in my opinion, my humble opinion, is that, you know, you really need to have, that's why biomechanics, I think, it's a sexy term, and I think, but it's also an overused term. And you have the bio aspect of the biomechanics, and you have the mechanics of the biomechanics. And the bio means that you really need to have mastery, or at least control over the understanding of a biological system, i.e. the human body. And then the mechanics portion comes from someone who's got a very strong grounding in mechanical engineering. And when you combine those two, it really becomes an animal of its own that allows you to bridge the gap between the detective, the engineer, and the physician.
Okay, you've done work in a few areas actually. So you've got some publications on, for example, injury biomechanics in traffic collision. You've done something on like body-worn cameras and how that plays a role in investigations and that sort of thing. But there's two in particular that I want to bring up, and actually that's one of the reasons why I was putting up the website. And one of them is let me go back. Excuse me. Let me go back this way. And there's two papers. Actually, I'm going to let them run at the bottom here. But if anybody's interested, if you go to gtdscientific.com and then go to their public relations and select publications, just do a look for here. You got computer simulations and use of force investigations is one of them. And the second one is going to be this other one that I'm putting up here. Oh, here we go. And that one is going to be application of biomechanical modeling to police shooting reconstruction. And then the other one was computer simulations and use of force investigations. And I was wondering, Geoff, if you could, the one in particular that was the officer involved shooting, if you could walk us through that case and what the importance was of being able to simulate the incident.
Yeah, great question. And this is something that the Ninth Circuit hadn't seen before. And, you know, and the last thing you want to do is bring anything that's considered novel by the court, because it can be rejected, of course, as you know. And so, but these computer simulations that we used are rooted in science, and they're heavily validated, not only at a component level, but also at a system level. And so that makes it now admissible evidence. And we're using these systems in a unique way, because you also have to be careful that they're mimicking the kinematics of the human body, but they come with limitations. And so as long as you can work within those limitations, it can give you extremely valuable information. And it did so in this particular case. So this was a file where there was a domestic dispute. Two officers responded, and as soon as they came on scene, the suspect took off running. One officer followed on foot and soon lost the suspect. The other one followed in his patrol vehicle, eventually caught up with the suspect, and then took chase on foot. It went down a narrow back alley. There was a scuffle, and the only witnesses of this event were, there was one visual witness that says like it was across a parking lot through some trees, and they saw that there was two men struggling. That's basically what they said. So really was incredible information. And there was two audio witnesses that were in the carports adjacent to the kind of the alleyway that they were struggling in. They said they heard the jingling of handcuffs and then two shots in quick succession. Okay, so that's all we had. And we're left to rely, if you will, on a potentially biased narrative. And that's where the whole scientific method started to play. As you know, Eugene, the scientific method consists of an idea around a result. So a hypothesis, if you will. And because we only had one narrative, there becomes our hypothesis. And then we test against that hypothesis, and if we can't reject it, then the last step is that we must accept it. And so that was the sequence, is how we approach this file. And basically what we did, and anytime you're going to do a simulation, it's like any modeling software really, is that garbage in equals garbage out. So you have to know that the opposite side is going to attack your inputs. So your inputs have to be very solid. And so we took the narrative and we created what we called a statement quantification video, where we just played out the narrative between two people and then made measurements from that video. We looked at, forward velocity, we got elbow angles, shoulder angles, torso angles, all this kind of stuff. And then we were also, we did some testing in the lab. We wanted to know what the force was on this particular round in this particular section of the body. And the reason was because we thought that there might be some influence over the movement pattern at the location where the bullet actually landed. Turns out that, and let me just back up a little bit, because as you know, Eugene, typical ballistics equations don't necessarily account for force. Like conservation of energy, for example, conservation of momentum, are typical ballistics approaches to describe what's happening there quantitatively, but they don't give you force. And when you're using a force-sensitive simulation, you need to account for that. And so we actually got ballistic medium at the appropriate distance that was dictated by the medical examiner's description of the wound path. Then we got a bone simulant that matched the thickness of the cortical bone, at least in the sacrum, that it smashed through, and then it embedded itself in the soft tissue of the buttock. And we recorded that load, and it was around 600 pounds, which sounds like a lot, but it doesn't last for a very long time. And so the overall momentum imparted to the model is actually quite low, but we're glad that we did the testing, because it made the model more accurate and therefore more difficult to argue against. But there was other things as well. We did a dynamic shooting test and other things like that, and then we ran the model, and the model was simply, well, you can see the figure there for yourself. It's this humanoid that moves forward in space and time and then simply collapse on the ground. And believe it or not, the opposite side, and I quote, said, "Big whoop, you get shot, you fall down." And I said, okay, well, let's take a look at this a little bit more carefully here. And did you know, by the way, that if you fall in free fall from 3 feet, you can fracture your skull? And yet we're not seeing any fractures of the skull here. And yet the head was 3 feet off the ground when the fall started to occur. Because the second bullet, I should explain, actually went into the back of the neck, transected the spinal cord, effectively cutting any communication between the brain and the rest of the body. So we could assume at this point that the body was falling under the acceleration due to gravity alone, and that no muscular activity was assisting. So knowing that, then, where did the load go? Because as I mentioned earlier, Eugene, you got to match the overall magnitude, location, and direction. And so if we didn't see a fracture in the skull, then where did the load go? And so what we found was, if you follow the model closely, that the first thing that make contact with the ground are the knees. And so that would obviously take up a lot of the load. And the beauty of these computer simulations is you can actually quantify that. The next thing that hit the ground was the elbows. And this now helped us confirm that the arms were in front of the body, reaching for the officer's primary firearm, which was part of the officer's narrative. And you can now see how piece by piece the result of the movement actually started to become consistent with the officer's narrative. But that was just one piece. There was lots of different things. And then by the time the head actually made contact with the ground, we had a kind of a forward sliding motion along the ground, which made a lot of sense with the abrasions that the medical examiner detailed on the body itself. Even though these weren't the lethal wounds, they're very important with respect to the reconstruction of the events.
So so this is interesting. It's nice when things align with the testing and with the simulation and everything. So I've been through the report, and it just all the pieces come together. Like and usually when it's a simple explanation and everything fits, it's quite nice. Which brings me to two other points. Empirical testing, because you do a lot of empirical testing, and the technology, both in hardware and software. So I want to ask you about how, well, one thing is how you manage the testing and when you decide when to test or not, but also how has the technology and the software changed, especially like in your area over the past few years, 10 years, like has there been a change? Is it kind of the same? I mean, are there any things in particular that you're using when you do a testing for a case or something like that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I kind of want to, that was a multi
Yeah.
statement question. So I want to start from the beginning, which was, it's nice when things are clicking on a file, and you're absolutely right. And the what that tells me is when things start to click like that is that at the end of the day, it's just physics. Because what happened is what happened. And so if things are falling together, it's because that's what happened. And so that's kind of one of our mottos around here actually, is that physics doesn't lie. And so if you're getting inconsistencies, you've either missed something or you're going down the wrong rabbit hole. So that's kind of something we try to shore up early on. Then, you also talked about approaches. When do you decide to use modeling? When is it just a strict opinion? Or when do you start to use, bring in technology with respect to physical testing? That is a great question, and something that I tend to run by the clients first. So, for example, sometimes you're dealing with smaller agencies that just don't have the budgets of the larger agencies, and you, or here's even a better caveat, is when it's a criminal file. And now you've got to use beyond reasonable doubt. That's the premise you're working under. And so now, to me, beyond a reasonable doubt is 95th percentile confidence level if we're talking research terms. And as you know, Eugene, that's a full-blown research study, and yet the budget for criminal investigations tend to be less than for civil suits, because civil suits have tons of money tied to them, whereas a criminal suit, you're just getting I shouldn't say just, but the justification for a large budget tends to not be the focus. And so it's interesting. And so when you're presented with these different scenarios, I tend to just sit down with my clients and just say, look, what is it that you need? What is the single critical aspect of this file that you need us to answer? And what's the overall budget that you want us, that you need us to stay under? And then that allows us to prioritize everything from there on in. And I can just say, okay, guys, we're not going to do, or I should say, we're going to do a modeling approach to this particular file, because I know it's essentially much more resource efficient than if we were to do a full-scale reconstruction of events with physical testing. And so that's kind of how I try to explain to the client between quality, cost, and quickness, and where this file is best suited to kind of approach. And then I try to explain that to them, and they go ahead and do it. So that's kind of the process, if you will, to get down those roads. But if I was to take a physical testing approach and talk about the technology, it really, this I could elaborate on hugely. I don't know how much time we have, Eugene, but it's a super interesting area, because yes, the technology has advanced, and I'd say in the two areas that are actually important for us, and that is size. Well, three things really: size, weight, and speed. Have the size has decreased, the speed has increased, and the weight has decreased. So as you know, there's this thing called the observer effect. If you want to measure anything, as soon as you start measuring it, you change the system, right? And if you're changing the system, you're not actually measuring what you want to measure. So and we could start all the way back to the sensor. Like, you have to know what is it about the system that you want to know further about? So then, are you choosing the appropriate sensor with the appropriate sensitivity and overall range? Then, are you collecting that analog system fast enough? Everyone talks about Nyquist theorem, and Nyquist theorem is just double the frequency of the maximum frequency sound found in the signal. But that's a very easy and very, I think, basic look at it. I think if you're using only Nyquist theorem, you're missing some important parts of that signal. And then it finally gets into the A to D card and, makes its way into a computer somewhere. And of course, engineers love to filter things. And if we're now applying that data to, say, an injury from the literature, you can change the magnitude of that load based on how you filter it. And so, feeding the lawyer these types of questions becomes extremely important, because often the people that are making these measurements don't truly understand the equipment that they're using. And so it's easy to trip them up. And the biggest red flag for me is if I'm going through a report and I don't see a detailed explanation of the actual sensor, the sampling rate, and the data acquisition kit that they actually used. So anyways, and we could go on and on and on about that.
No, it's a very good point, and don't worry about the time. This is our conversation. We can talk for as long as we want. But you bring up an interesting point. Even earlier, you mentioned something about making sure you have the proper inputs, and I know I've seen this myself when. So, for example, there was one case I had. It's years ago now, but it was a collision that happened on a highway, and there were 3 companies that analyzed the same data in a vehicle simulation software, right? So basically they're going to do this thing. There were 3 separate answers, 3 outputs, right? So yep. The inputs, when you're talking, especially with the body and that sort of thing, the starting conditions and all those types of things have a huge factor, right? So you need to know what you're doing, and you need to know how to set those initial conditions up. Otherwise, you get all kinds of stuff, and there's no way to even interpret it, right? So I think that was a really good point. And so I don't know how you guys check it or how you work with it through the models and that sort of thing, but
usually, people are pretty astute, and the people that are involved in this type of work are fairly well educated and experienced in their area. Where I find the nuances go south is on interpretation and the applied assumptions. That's where I think things can go completely haywire, and it really becomes the fight between the engineers. And I always tell people, don't go there, because that's not your audience. Your audience is the judge and the jury and the people making decisions on the file. And so, as you know, especially in Canada, we're working on behalf of the courts, and we're assisting the courts. And so, to be as objective as possible, to state your assumptions upfront for everyone to see, that now kind of sets the stage for your interpretation. And I think if people haven't given that information or haven't given it clearly, it is just an immediate source for available questions.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. We have in Canada, if you're on civil cases, a Form 53, which is it's like this. You sign it, says you're going to be impartial, right? So, but it's just a form, and then you hand it back. It means absolutely nothing, but it just says you're going to do it, right? At least you signed something that said you were. I find often we get into situations where we're quibbling over the little tiny details, and they're not always important unless that specific detail is what the case is hinging on, right? So in terms of research, in terms of the kinds of things that you guys are working on, I mean, you probably see all kinds of opportunities in this area where there needs to be, like, there's open doors and people need to do more work. Can you talk about what some of those areas are, or maybe even some places that you want to go with research?
Yeah. There is a plethora of areas I would love to dive into. The limiting factors are, of course, resources, both in in person power and money. Although it doesn't take a lot of money to do good work, I'd say taser is an area that deserves some work from an operational perspective. Not just necessarily. I know you're doing some work, Eugene, and I feel like some of the things that we've bumped up in against with respect to our files could be so easily explained if someone just did a specific study using tasers in specific environments, and it would give them very useful take homes that they can use in the field. And that's kind of where I think we best help the field, or is we kind of I think we're at the intersection of application and research, where I try to give them. So anyways, I really try to focus on take homes that they can use as soon as they read that paper. And so operationally, the taser, I'd love to do some work there. Having a realistic injury model, I think, is important too for us, because often we can get lost in the injury biomechanics of it all, and honestly, no one really understands the numbers. And so what we need is something that we can give as a demonstrative and say, see here, this looks exactly like the photographs the forensic ident person took on the day, and we're able to recreate that, and lo and behold, the numbers that we measured from there match the numbers in our report. And so it no longer matters what the numbers actually are. It becomes this visual comparison between what was found on the scene and the injury we were able to recreate in the lab.
Yeah, the accident reconstruction guys, I have to give them credit, because they have charts and graphs and tests and stuff for all kinds of stuff. So when somebody wants to know how old 65 85-year-old grandma walks, they've got charts and graphs for that. When they want to know certain forces, I'm part of one of these forums or whatever, or post things, and there's often people requesting, does anybody have a photograph of this kind of a collision? And so there's a lot more information available, and I can only imagine you're in your world, you may be stuck with, well, we just got to test it. We don't have a resource to lean on. I imagine there are databases and things you can use, but for a lot of these types of injuries, they may be so unique, and of course we can't just go around shooting people and stabbing people and doing all kinds of things. So we don't have, you need some kind of a good substitute, or kind of a good model for that. So I mean, do you end up creating a lot of these models on yourself? You talked about the simulated bone and the gel, so you piece a lot of that stuff together yourself?
Typically, yes. We'll use a combination of gel, ballistics gel that's calibrated. We'll have a bone simulant, and then we've used blood packs included in that as well. And that gives you a great visual, but I'd like to be able to improve on that. I think, if we were to able to incorporate a proper, like a mechanically accurate skin model to go over top of that, maybe even an eye model to insert if there's been an eye injury. Maybe even, if you got really fancy, is to create some sort of material that matches the mechanical properties of the brain. Because then you could, with the onset of 3D printing, you could even have a brain case and fill it with saline, for example. Mm-hmm. And now you're getting way above what the average model would give you. So I don't think it's out of reach. I just think I am aware of several labs that are working in this area, but I have a feeling they're taking, like I say, we like to be very applied with our research. And so we'd like to take a step forward in that area, just so that our models are more accurate. But I know there's probably 3 or 4 labs that are really trying to get realistic on the whole thing, that are probably going to be more along the lines of medical research market rather than reconstruction for forensics.
Okay. In your cases, are you seeing more? Are you seeing more video and more, security camera stuff that will help you model like some of these things? Is it less or more? Do you notice a difference?
It's definitely more. The trend is definitely more. There's no question. Cell phone footage. Sometimes we'll get a combination of body cam, dash cam, cell phone, and security. All in the same incidents, all from different angles. But it's like four blind men touching an elephant. They all interpret it something different. And as you know, video is just a series of images, and I like to talk about it, kind of similarly to the quality of 3D scans, for example. Like if the conditions are right, the resolution will be high. If the conditions are bad, the resolution will be low. And so for each image that you look at in that series of images in the video, you'll have some images that I call, low noise or high recognizability. So if you took 10 individual observers, they could all typically agree what they see in that image is they can all describe the same thing. That's somebody's foot, there's somebody's hand, here's a flashlight, and it's moving from left to right across the frame, something like that. But then, you flip it to the next image and you get the same 10 observers, and all of a sudden nobody can agree. And so I don't think video evidence is as clear cut as everyone thinks it is. It's not this, I'm getting this spatial, time and space dimensions of exactly what happened. It's not like that at all. And in fact, I think what people in this industry need to realize is that it's a series of low noise images is what it is. And then you have to link those images with your theory of what actually happened. And now you start getting into validation, and now you start getting into scientific approaches and using various technologies. To give you an example, Eugene, I'm just super proud of this because we were just sitting around talking about this, and we had the opposite of a brain fart. But
what is that? I don't even know what that would be.
An epiphany, I guess.
Okay,
but
maybe.
We had a low light, very blurry incident body cam footage. Okay, so it was tight quarters as well. So these two men were about 7 feet from each other. It was low light conditions, and there was a lot of movement with respect to either men. And so it was difficult to figure out what was going on. And somebody came up with the idea. I think it was me. I'm going to take credit for that since we're live. And to say, well, why don't we overlay this incident video with thermal imaging of what we actually think happened? And so now what we can do is we have this overlay of thermal imaging motion that we can match to the low noise frames of the incident video. And so now we have this one frame which we can kind of match. Yeah, the hand's here, the foot's here. That makes sense. And then we go a few frames down to our next low noise frame, and we can now match certain features within that frame. And so then we can conclude that the movement that occurred between this frame and that frame in the thermal imaging is most likely the movement that occurred in the incident video. And so stuff like that is kind of out of the box. It's not necessarily being technically competent. It's about knowing what technology exists and how to apply it creatively. And so it's let's face it, that's why we get paid the big bucks is you got to know what you're doing, you got to know what's available to you, and you got to know how to answer the questions scientifically, objectively, and yes, that takes creativity.
Yeah, I would imagine too that, like, for example, when you're doing some of these cases and you're testifying, especially with juries, I mean, if you start throwing out numbers and forces and newtons and kilogram meters per whatever, they're just going to go, okay, yeah, I kind of remember some of that or whatever. But visuals, like, how important are the visuals in your work? I got to imagine that they have a significant importance, especially when you're talking about some of this complex stuff, motion and that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, someone who does scene documentation, you can speak to the importance of this stuff, and I can certainly tell your audience that if it's not simple, visual, and fundamental, you're done.
Yeah.
Simple, visual, fundamental. That's what you need to communicate. The rest, you can physics the, you know, I don't want to use bad words, but you know, you can physics the heck out of stuff all you want. Just put it in the appendix, you know, but make sure what you're communicating is simple, visual, and fundamental, and you'll have a very good argument on your hands.
Yeah, I mean, just some of the simple graphics that I've seen, like in your reports, I just find you look at it and it's like, okay, it's clear. I can see what's happening here. You know what I mean? You can see the sequence of motion. You can see the sequence of events or whatever. So, you know, some of these shootings and stuff, because of the way the body's articulated and things, there can be some really, you know, complex, you know, engagement between people and that sort of thing. So yeah, I can see how the visual can be super helpful with you with some of the little animations and some of the graphics that you do. Are you, you mentioned before about the science of violence, but what kind of training do you offer, like in general? Like, I know you have this science of violence thing. Are there other things that you do as well, or is that your main focus right now?
That's the main focus. You know, as you know, about anything about business is about focus, and that's where we're finding we can benefit clients most, is in the science of violence. We did create other. I was contracted by UBC, which is a big school here in Vancouver, to create a couple courses for their undergraduate students. One of them was in injury biomechanics, the other was in small business. And so we started teaching that, but it wasn't as aligned. It was a bit distracting, and it's a whole nother demographic that we're marketing to. And so what we found was the science of violence was a great way to put the package together, if you will, with respect to what we can offer. And so we cover fundamental physics, how that gets applied to the body, and then we look at specific deep dives, if you will. For example, you know, free body diagrams. You'll be familiar with free body diagrams. That's one thing that we think is critical in the science of violence, and yet most people watching the show won't even know what that is. And it's basically a way of applying engineering thinking to a scenario, and you don't even have to apply numbers to it. You just have to visualize where the loads are being applied to a specific object in three-dimensional space, and all of a sudden the way you think about that, the way you see something, is really, there's been a paradigm shift. And that's what I'm trying to get across to people with the science of violence, is that, you know, okay, here's some basic physics, here's how I apply it, here's some assumptions. Let's get into real world case studies and see how it gets really complex really fast. But if you hang on to these basic principles and, you know, kind of dive into some of these advanced concepts like free body diagrams, you can really change how you think and approach about an investigation. And I believe it really helps advance how people are approaching use of force investigations. I really do.
Well, I'll tell you what, my background's in aerospace engineering, and as a person that's working in this area now and trying to bring the thinking of engineering, because I always say it this way, that after my engineering, my pain and suffering, what I came out with was a different way of thinking. And I think that's what it was. It was problem solving. It was, you know, critical thinking about things. And so being able to apply that here, you know, in this area is really important. And I think you're doing amazing work. I love the fact that, you know, as a sort of fellow engineer, you're bringing these kinds of, you know, the education, the learning, the way of thinking, the scientific approach, the empirical testing that you guys are doing, I think is fantastic. So I won't push it any longer than this. I want to say, Geoff, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoy talking to you. I always enjoy, you know, good ideas. So we always bounce good ideas off each other and stuff like that, which I think is fantastic.
We really do. We think alike, Eugene. I appreciate that, and I appreciate what you're doing here. And thank you so much for having me again.
Well, it's a pleasure. Hang back for a second. I'm just going to say a few closing words, and then I'll come back and I'll just chat with you a little bit. Okay.
Will do.
Thanks a lot, Geoff.
Take care.
All right, folks. Well, I think that closes episode 5. Next week, with Geoff, we were talking about video. And so next week, we're going to have Grant Fredericks, who is a forensic video analyst. And we're going to be talking about the importance of video in a forensic investigation, whether it be, you know, officer-involved shootings, things like riots and things like that. Grant has a ton of experience, and I'm really looking forward to that talk. On that note, thank you very much, everybody. I wish you all the best and have a great day. Bye-bye.